Okay, looks like we are live now. By the way, for our viewers, I want to make sure they understand that picture on there it says iPhone, just a telephone receiver. That is Clay Taylor from the DPSOA. He's calling in today, but he's with us.
Good
Steve,
morning.
you wanna do
Hi.
this?
Very, very good. Thank you, Kevin. And also from the African American lawyer section, we have Nikki Green, myself, Steve Foster, and we should be joined by our chair en route to this meeting shortly, Rudy Mateo. So we have had several weeks of interaction to the goings on nationwide. And we want to kind of just give you a quick refresher that we have worked on these Wednesday mornings, addressing different issues, topics, ideas, thoughts in regards to how collaboration between law enforcement and not just the public, but those who serve in the legal world can get information, because some of it is misinformation, and we know this, to the general public in regards to creating a better environment, looking for improvements in the law, process, procedure, and functionality. So we took a couple of weeks off. We recognized that there was holiday season of Thanksgiving, and I appreciate that because so many people go from Halloween to Christmas and they skip over the ability to be thankful. And I think that one of the biggest things that I want to express is being thankful that there are the organizations and the persons with the background, experience, and willingness to come together to improve our communities and to improve the way that we operate between and amongst people as professionals and as civilians, because again, it takes all of us to have a stable and safe community and society. With that said, we've gone over a lot of topics, and Kevin, if I'm understanding, all of the previous Wednesday mornings have been captured so that anyone who would want to go back and see what has been discussed can do that.
They are. They're available on the TMPA Facebook page.
Excellent. And so with that, we kind of wanted to take a look at a couple of things today, because we have had the discussions. Some of the things that we would believe as we started would be not just thoughts and ideas, but actual functioning things and new ways and ideas to make improvements that we could look at with regards to somewhat of implementing these in a legislative way, or not even, they could be done by rulemaking. Either way, we were looking for improvements to what we have currently. So I think one of the things discussed is in regards, and Kevin, I want you to be able to properly say this. The elimination, is it of chokeholds? Is that am I expressing that right in regards to restraints?
It's common terminology that's used to talk about a number of different tactics, a number of different types of restraints.
Correct.
There's different types of restraints that are referred to as chokeholds.
And we had discussed, and it here is another member of the African American lawyer section, our chair, the Councilman Rudy Mateo. Rudy, thanks for joining us as well. And
Steve, I was going to say, we also have the term, along with chokeholds, you also have strangleholds, like a neck restraint. Those
well,
are some of the terms that
I just wanted to have the terminology from the law enforcement side, because again, I think sometimes there are some.
Well, Steve, our terminology for that, for the most part, is called a lateral vascular neck restraint.
Okay.
Got it.
So there we go.
I have
Okay.
that too.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't, for the most part, I don't know of any law enforcement that actually uses a true chokehold.
Okay. So modifications to those techniques, I think we had discussed initially, We talked about having a database that would keep a public record of those in law enforcement that had incidents, agreed upon incidents that would rise to a level to where we would be able to keep track of some of the more egregious offenders who may travel throughout jurisdictions. Anyway, my point being, there were topics of discussion that I would like to review that has come across our Wednesday mornings in regards to having a list of things that certainly should be able to be agreed upon. In this forum, we recognize there were things that needed to be discussed, and then there were probably things that would be not necessarily agreed upon, but we would certainly give the floor to both schools of thoughts or multiple schools of thought. So we wanted to do that. And then Kevin, you had mentioned to me offline that you also wanted to take some time, and I think this is an excellent forum to do it, talk about Rudy's new opportunity and position that he has accepted, which I think also lends to not just the credibility of what we've been doing over these last few months, but also lends to the credibility of improving our community and society throughout our state. So, Kevin, I would ask you, what from the law enforcement side makes sense? And I know we had a quick offline discussion in regards, because I know there are some pretty straightforward improvements that there was really no resistance, or should I say pushback, or a recognition of this would assist, I think, in the overall improvement of relations and information distributed to those in any city or society in our state.
Well, there are, as you know, there's already hundreds of bills that have been filed, and there are any number of other, one-pagers that have been distributed that have a lot of different ideas. But because of your experience in the legislature, you also know the devil is always in the details. We can talk all day long about filing a bill, and we can name it whatever we want to name it, but
Sure.
What's actually in the bill is what dictates whether or not it becomes good public policy or becomes public policy at all. There's a lot of things that we have talked about that are being suggested that most law enforcement, and maybe not most law enforcement agencies, but most of the larger intermediate sized law enforcement agencies have already adopted those as a matter of policy anyway. They've already been implemented at the local level. Whether or not you want to codify those and put them in statute may or may not be a good idea, because let's face it, policies need to be flexible. There needs to be times that you can look at a situation and say, you know what, maybe following policy in this particular incident was not in the best interest of public safety. It was not in the best interest of that individual. And the most blatant example I can give you there is anytime you pass a law that says law enforcement officers shall arrest when X, Y, or Z happens, it's almost never a really good idea, because there's always those cases where you need to look at the totality of the circumstances and say, listen, this is one of those times we do not want to make an actual custodial arrest. Let's step back, think about this, give it to the DA's office, let the grand jury review it, but it may not be a great idea to actually do it right now. So there always has to be a certain amount of discretion involved. And I think the same thing holds true here. We've talked about the chokeholds or neck restraints. When the Trump administration issued an executive order about this back in the late spring, early summer, they talked about chokeholds and basically said we are banning chokeholds at the national level unless the use of deadly force is in fact justified in that specific incident. And as you and I have talked about, I don't know that we want to send cops out on the streets and tell them that there's any particular tool or technique they're not allowed to use if they are in a fight for their lives. It just becomes a whole different type of dynamic at that point. So Steve, when you ask me what are the things that we will support legislatively, the answer is I can't give you a specific because I haven't seen the legislation yet. I can tell you, I can look at the particular bills that are out there and tell you, I think this is a good idea, that's a bad idea, whatever. But it will have to be a process. We believe in transparency. We believe in accountability. We believe in good law enforcement. And we believe that law enforcement officers should always be held to a higher standard. We do not believe that we should handcuff these officers and then ask them to go out there and do a job that is physically impossible to do. Because A, we're setting them up for failure, and B, we're going to wind up not being able to get qualified personnel that are willing to do the job.
Recognizably so. I think that leads to a question or leads to the topic of training. And again, we always, I don't use that word often. However, I recognize working alongside law enforcement in the Texas Senate and being in that committee, training gets tied to funding. And especially
Steve, before you do that, can I do a follow-up question with Kevin? Because I think he raised a good point.
Sure.
When he was talking about codifying some of the policies and then not codifying some because of the flexibility. Could you think of an example? And I know you gave us a couple when you talked about the chokehold, but given that there are some municipalities that will not implement things that would be beneficial or that would help with some of the criminal justice reform, which is why there are a number of requests to codify some of these procedures so that it is done on a uniform and standard basis. So when you balance those two, having that flexibility, but then also making sure there's uniformity and that there are critical, I think the chokehold, the ban on chokeholds, neck restraints, things of that nature. Some of the items in the 8 can't wait that have been implemented across many, like you said, jurisdictions with respect to police reform. When would we want to codify some of these so that they are being adhered to? Because you're going to have some places that are not going to want to do it at all, and so that kind of is a disadvantage.
And when I say codify them, I mean in the actual penal code. I mean putting them in there where there's a criminal penalty for the individual officer.
Okay.
With what should be policy rather than statute. Now, putting it in the form of a mandate, and I think that's where Steve was going with this conversation, is talking about the actual funding portion of this. And I think Travis, I don't want to speak for you, but I think we're going to wind up talking a little bit about what's going on in Massachusetts right now, which, by the way, I found I was fascinated about that. But setting a standard and then holding the agencies accountable for not living up to the standards is completely different from creating a statute that tells individual officers that in any given circumstance, they have to behave in exactly a certain way that may or may not work in a given circumstance, and then threatening to put those officers in jail because they failed is not good public policy. That's the argument we're making.
Okay. That makes sense.
Well, with that, there are things we had talked about, kind of a state registry, because we have some who switch jurisdictions and may leave for various reasons. And we know that sometimes there have been criminal defense attorneys that use and have information, but we would say that if there was a possible database that had availability to the public, and again, we weren't ever saying that information was not available to the public, but not readily available. And I think that's kind of having, we kind of mentioned it as something as similar to or akin to an NCIC or a TCIC, where you could go in and you could see information on some of these scenarios that officers may have. I don't know if that's something that you've seen in some of the legislation, Kevin, but that was something that we thought if you could check up on someone may have risen to a level of incidents that they would be in this kind of public database because the information is kind of out there already.
When you say TCI, I'm going to have to ask Clay and Travis, are those now public databases? Because
I didn't say that they were necessarily public. I was saying that would be gathered in a similar instance that could be made public or that would be made public because of incident.
okay. And, you know, there's a reason why NCIC, TCIC is not available to the general public. There are privacy issues that need to be dealt with, and NCIC, TCIC include arrest records, even though there may not be a conviction, you know.
Correct. Right.
So the right to privacy. And so and this is one of those things we're talking about, the devil is in the details. If we're going to look at any sort of a registry or a database, what all has to be included? And then we've got to start talking about, okay, how many different ways has that information been vetted? Has it been vetted at all? You know, we've talked about the fact we've got 2,700 different law enforcement agencies in the state of Texas, and they may have 2,700 different internal policies about the way they handle complaints and discipline and so on and so forth.
And a lot of those policies are made up depending on, you know, the population or your citizens and what they like or don't like or stuff like that, and what they're willing to go with. So, I mean, they vary greatly from agency to agency on what the citizens are okay with or not okay with.
And they also vary from one regime to another. I mean, if you've got an elected sheriff and a new sheriff gets elected, policies change. You know, at 12:01 a.m. on January 1st, you've got a whole new policy manual. And so the way all that stuff is handled may change completely. Our point would be there are times where making this information readily available to the public, if it has not been fully vetted, is bad for public safety, not for the officers, but it's bad for actually trying to deliver services, you know, because as you mentioned, Steve, if it can be manipulated, it can be, you know, distorted in such a way that it makes it more difficult for those officers to go out and do their jobs.
Well, I'll say this. I think you're absolutely right. I think the variation of 2,700 will definitely have a spectrum. But I believe that certainly there could be a general source or a general sense of standard. And again, I don't think you would need or want to include everything because as mentioned in prior discussion, not everything would rise to that. Or if a complaint is made, and all of you gave examples of having complaints made on you, that's not necessarily a grounds for including it in a registry.
Right.
And so I think, you know, you would have to have some level that would adhere to a somewhat of a standard, given the variations that can happen from regime to regime and from, you know, policy to policy from those agencies. And it may be size, and maybe based on size, as you know, we bracket things in legislation, or it may just be in relation to whatever the situation is. And that, again, can always be vetted.
And if I recall correctly, we had this conversation a couple months ago when we were talking about, because we didn't know there are, just like Travis said, there are actual databases out there that are supposed to be collecting this information. But what we're hearing is that isn't necessarily being uploaded by the local policing entity with that information, you know, being collected on that. So would it just be a tweak more of, hey, listen, you know, we have this here. Yes, you are required to actually update this information, or would it have to be something along what Steven said, even though, you know, just like you said, I mean, I don't think people understand how many vast array of law enforcement agencies you have across the state of Texas. Would a standard need to be set to make sure that for the specific criterion, or has that standard already been there and just not been enforced?
And Rudy, just to add to what you just said, I think that brings back up that conversation that we had about the F5, because that was included when we were talking about that, about how it's inconsistently used, or like even like with the different sections on the honorable discharge, general discharge, and dishonorably discharged, just not really having a standard on how those different sections are used. So yeah.
Which, by the way, would also get us into a conversation about the Sunset Commission's recent report on the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement and the recommendations that they are making. And that it has met with mixed reviews, obviously.
You're putting it nicely.
I do think it's something that we want to talk about at some point in this process, because there's stuff in that report that is critical that the vast majority of Texans don't know and will be surprised to find out. And I'm going to get back to the Massachusetts thing, because if you haven't read the articles that are out there, there's a piece of legislation that has passed the legislature or the assembly. I don't know what they call it in Massachusetts, in the great Commonwealth, but it's now been sent to the governor for him to decide whether or not to sign it. But it is a law enforcement reform package. And what it does is it creates a certification process for all the cops in the state. Think about that. They are just now creating a certification process so that they can then create a system whereby the state can decertify officers. How many states in the union don't already certify law enforcement officers statewide? Texas has been doing it since 1970, I guess, was when TCOL was first created finally. How is it that
one of the things that was on there was if they're guilty of a felony?
But that's talking about the decertification process. I'm talking about the fact that
that's part of it in Massachusetts, is if you're convicted of a felony, then they're going to decertify you. Well, that's been going on here for, since I can remember.
But to that point, Travis, how many people know that? And and to Kevin's point, that's interesting.
But does that mean they could have been certified before now, even if they had a conviction for a felony on their records? That since there is no certification process, could the Boston Police Department hire a convicted felon if they wanted to?
I'm sure they did. I'm sure they did.
That's just amazing to me. So
or they had I'm sure they had the ability to do that.
Right.
Let me kind of measure that statement, because I don't want to without knowing. But you certainly could say, because there's felonies that are nonviolent that you could say, listen, that's not going to pose an issue of hiring this man or woman as an officer, and so we can discern between what they may have. Maybe it's outstanding checks or what have you, because they had a hard time from a certain period of time that rose to that, but that really was determined by, like you said, that agency, that's not an issue with regards to.
Maybe at the time it was a felony, but under today's statutes, it would be a Class 2 misdemeanor, which has happened in the course of my career, because I've been around so long, So it's just, I think it's amazing to hear that there are states that don't even have a certification process up to this moment. Okay.
Correct.
Texas is at least ahead of the curve in some ways right there. But to get back to Rudy's question, I think it was Rudy's question, it cannot simply be a tweak. It's going to have to be a more sweeping addressing of the issues that we have. The thing is, what we believe has been going on is a push toward reducing our law enforcement services, reducing the size of agencies, reducing the personnel, the staffing levels, and so on and so forth. And we think that is really bad public policy. We think that whatever issues we have, and we don't deny that there are issues, that those issues can be addressed with better training, better standards, better management. And by the way, we will argue all through this legislative session and until the cows come home that poor management in law enforcement is a much bigger problem than rogue cops. Not that rogue cops aren't a problem, but rogue cops get weeded out, all the time, day in and day out. Bad management. I've made this joke for years, Steve. Law enforcement is kind of like the NFL. We recycle failures. If you're a really bad head coach, guess what your next job is going to be? You're going to be a head coach somewhere else.
Right.
Or you become a U.S. senator. I'll speak.
And Steve and Rudy, I think too, you know, that we've been saying for a long time is that if they're conducting thorough background checks like they should be conducting, you know, they're not going to hire these officers who have been in trouble, you know, for
Right.
various things. Minor things, you know, they're going to look past and get hired, and that's okay. But you know, the lack of doing a thorough background check, which we believe is a big part of these officers moving around, because some places just don't care, you know, or they have to hire certain individuals because, you know, they're unable to afford being able to pay other people. You know, I think a lot of that comes into that they overlook things for that purpose.
Right.
And we do, which gets to
If I can
Christian.
Travis on here with that, put on my council member hat on this. So we know, just like we said, I mean, law enforcement, police departments make about 50% of our municipality, average municipalities funding. That's what it is, our budgets, our annual budgets. I spoke to a council member the other day of another municipality who was surprised to find out that officers are responsible for their own CLE training, their continuing education training every year. And that
Yeah, at some departments, it just depends on where you're at. They're
Exactly.
paying for it out of their own pocket.
Exactly. So is some departments will pay for it, some unions may pay for it, but more often than not, I mean, nonetheless, it falls on the officer to get it paid and get it done with.
Right, because the person who gets punishment if it doesn't get done is the officer, not the department.
Yeah. See, there you go. So the question is that, and then that got into the quality of the trainer and everything else that we'd spoken about before with that. So do you see it as a financial burden on these municipalities to do these background checks, or
Absolutely.
why aren't
Yep,
they?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, I think, Kevin, the biggest bombshell of the statement that you said that I think should resonate across the entire country is it's not the number of officers you have. It's the ability to have good, trained, managed officers on your agency staff.
Right. And
Because-
accountability from the top to the bottom. The
Because
accountability.
a bad head coach is going to have a bad team.
We have made this argument for years. You cannot make any organization, I don't care what organization you work for, you cannot make it professional from the bottom up.
Correct.
It's got to start at the other end.
Absolutely. And again, you had mentioned three things: training, standards, and management being one of that I underlined. Is there a way that we can highlight doing things that start from that top down so you can replace that bad head coach or manager, so therefore it rolls downward in a good way to that agency? Because I think that's where you're allowing the folks, and again, I wholeheartedly, so that people recognize this, will say that y'all's biggest concern and biggest detriment to good cops are bad cops. And if you're not having that management take care of that scenario, I think what gets portrayed by the media, and we haven't touched on that aspect of everything, is going to be that one or two poor law enforcement person in that agency. And that's then going to taint everything else that agency has done because of that incident.
Yeah. Yes, I think there is a way. I think the process, whether or not we can get the appropriate policymakers and decision makers to get on board with this, is going to be a different matter, because there's too many of them have their own vested interest in this concept. But when we talk about accountability and oversight, that's the solution. But the solution has to include due process. It has to include that whatever process we're going to have for reviewing the actions of our officers, for reviewing departmental policies, whatever oversight there's going to be, it has to be completely transparent, and the accountability has to start at the very top, which means that every officer in the state has to have some meaningful due process when it comes to reviewing their job performances.
Because I mean, let's be honest. You know, officers, we all make mistakes,
Absolutely.
and you know the ways certain people look at that mistake or different ones, it's going to depend on the department and who's looking at it. But the officer has to have the ability to say, hey, look, or if someone feels that there was a mistake, and the officer doesn't feel necessarily that it was, they have to have the ability to say, hey, hang on a second here, let's look at this and give me a fair shake at it.
Well, I think that what's real shaky at this point is just the relationship between law enforcement and the community. And that, I think, has led to distrust. So if you're trying to have due process with transparency, you're not, and then you insert the media that I think forms a wedge because of how things get reported. And we spoke about that. We don't come together in a way that puts the professionalism, the due process, and the transparency in one equation for the professional, from law enforcement to the community and the citizen.
And Steve, I think that depends on the community, because we have a lot of communities out there where they have a really good relationship and whatnot, but as an overall whole, I can see that, and you're right. The media is what's pushing a lot of that.
But again, we want to look past that. We want to eliminate that to get to where we're not affected by that sense. And I mean, Rudy, you've brought up several instances in a fairly growing community that's next to 11th largest city in the country, Pflugerville, and how y'all have gone out to administer the way that you run your law enforcement in your community. And it's worked very well. But again, do we need to take models such as yours and show how that works across the state? And maybe we find models like Houston on the larger cities. We find Pflugerville in the small, medium, and then we find other well-operating municipalities that we can bring together, because there needs to be reformation, but it has to have good examples for people to follow. Because if you don't, and you don't have the good management, as Kevin has mentioned, you start seeing your efficiency not to go well in your communities. And Travis has rightfully so said, there's operating communities such as yours, Rudy, that are doing it. But for the ones that are, there's some that aren't. And a lot of that is tied to funding. And a lot of that is tied to distrust, because information that has been brought forth may be slanted, because it gets you to watch the 6 and the 10, but it doesn't help your community with relying on the professionals that are there to protect and serve.
Well, and to your point, I mean, that's that kind of trust that's engendered makes a discernible difference. I mean, the reason why we're the 3rd fastest growing city in the country is because you're looking for quality of life, and you're looking to be safe. I mean, people want to be safe. All people want to be safe. They want their families, their folks to feel safe. They want to be able to have quality education, quality schools, good quality of life, great place to live, et cetera, like that. And I mean, having proper law enforcement be a part of the community is part of that. And I think that what's befuddling at times, and I think this is where I get frustrated with the media and other folks trying to pit people together, those aren't mutually exclusive. Law enforcement's not saying, they're not saying no, we don't want safe communities, and people aren't saying no, we don't want safe communities. We have an agreement regarding that, and how do you make that work? And then when you have a city like mine, it's a majority minority city. I mean, don't you dare tell people of color don't want law enforcement or don't appreciate good law enforcement. It's not true. And and the thing is that all people should not want bad law enforcement, and it's trying to find reasonable solutions to that. And I think that, Kevin, Travis, I keep thinking about what you were just saying regarding that database and the requirements, and it can't just be a tweak. We've got to do some things with that. We've got to get this information to folks who are on, I mean, I hate to put it on the tip of the spear on both sides of these issues, to understand that there's common ground to get things done with that and to show that. I mean, I hope people are watching these videos realizing this. It was the whole reason why, and I give a lot of credit to Steve and Nikki for helping to work with you guys to put this together and talk about these issues and show that, because there is ground where we can work and try to work together on these things. There's things where we disagree with, I understand.
Absolutely.
There's common ground on these things with that, and we're all trying to do the betterment of the community with that. And I think
there's more common ground than I think has ever been portrayed.
Well, yeah, and what's even more frustrating, here's the interesting part too. There's not enough information about what's already out there. And
Right.
that's probably the most significant thing that I've seen as an issue with that. Nikki's highlighted in because there's just not enough discussion about, well, we already do, wait, what? What, this is already done? Wait, this is here? Oh, yeah, it may not be enforced, but this is over. You've looked at that. Whenever Fred brought up that report, Kevin, that had been done years ago, that he was like, hey, wait a minute, I was on that committee that was commissioned by the legislature to do this report. And, Nikki had found this report and he's like, this is the first time I'm seeing this in public. I've never seen it. That's an issue.
It's not accessible. And then, like you said, the education and information, because you don't need to circle the wagons. And that's why I think that these calls have been very helpful with kind of determining what is already out there. How do we tweak it? And then how do we make it more accessible? Because that may solve, some of the minor issues that are out there.
Well, and here's the thing, you have staffers and Rudy and Kevin, and you know this, they don't know this. They don't know what's already there. They're coming up with things that we probably would say, half that list is already out there, friends. You just don't know. We've had people that have been on our calls weekly that already worked on that. And so this is a place where I believe we need to take what we have and really get it to, the 6 Black chiefs of staff and let them know, here's information that can be successful, that can help you not waste time or take time away from something that's already done. To the Senate Criminal Justice Committee and those on the House side, hey, listen, we found all this information that's already there. You don't have to include this in the new legislation. You're readdressing things that just haven't been made public, because there's been, sensible people that have already dealt with these issues, and we don't know about it, because it's amazing that Massachusetts is now coming to where we've been 40 years ago, 50 years ago. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and to that point, Steve, think about that, right? We talk about quote unquote woke Massachusetts, right? Progressive Massachusetts, and it's like, wait a minute, they're getting to where we're at regarding that. And I will say this, I think it's the first meeting I've been where it's public now. Now, I'm president and executive director for the Texas Black Caucus Foundation. I will definitely be working with you guys regarding to try to get this information done and try to get these information to the caucus members, trying to see what we can do. And finally, have a place to distribute, meet with folks, be a ground where folks can talk and have these conversations with it, because I feel like it's my job and duty, and more time than ever with what's going on in this country, you need to have a place where you can have these discussions and these possibilities to get done with it. And it makes sense. It makes sense. And it shows people, hey, we're not just talking about an issue, we're trying to solve it, and we're trying to find viable ways, possible viable ways with it as well, and where we can meet and try to have a discussion with that.
There shouldn't be distrust from groups with law enforcement. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I wanted to show by having law enforcement alongside in all of these meetings, is that no one's running away. No one's not talking about and discussing these things. But you would think sometimes, because of media, TMPA and DPSOA would never sit down and speak to Black lawyers, because that would be counterproductive to what they stand for. And that's completely erroneous.
And Steve, from experience, from the years we've known each other, that's never been the case. We've always been willing to sit down and visit. And if you will go to the offices of Harold Dutton and Chairman Coleman and folks like that, they will also tell you we've always been willing to sit down in their offices and discuss these issues. But you make a
Senator West as well.
Senator West, we got a meeting with Senator West tomorrow where we're going to talk about some of this stuff. But you made a very good point. This has to be a two-pronged effort. We have to address this at the legislature, in the legislative making, the policy making process. But we also have to find a way to address it with the general public, because
Yes.
otherwise, if the legislature comes out with good, solid public policy based upon the facts, but it doesn't meet up with the false narratives that are still out there in the public domain, the public is going to be unhappy with what the legislature has done. So we've still got an issue. We've still got that distrust. The distrust will continue to be toward our government, because let's face it, the distrust of law enforcement is in large part just a reflection of the distrust of government. Law enforcement happens to be the most prominent example of government that people get to deal with on a day in and day out basis.
I was going to say, I would say accessible.
And we're the ones that are featured in the media. Let's face it, dialogue driven, issue oriented conversations like these are not making TikTok, are they?
No.
People aren't tuning in to see this kind of stuff, even though I do want to mention, by the way, State Representative Tony Tinderholt is watching, obviously, because he posted a comment saying he looks forward to working with all of us during the legislative session. Your Honor, thank you for watching. We appreciate you and all your efforts. And we also look forward to working with you. But the process, even if the process that the legislature works remarkably well and we come out with great public policy, it may not be accepted.
It has to transfer. It has to transfer to the communities in the state of Texas.
Right. So we got to take this show on the road, Steve.
Well, and this is where it's key that, okay, we're talking about, because Steve, I understand you're saying that they shouldn't distrust law enforcement, but I also understand there are many people who do. And so therefore it's got to be you've got to get people who are able to bridge those gaps and have those conversations. That's where community policing goes, so forth. So when Fred had that conversation saying, hey, listen, if you cut our budget to everything else there, first thing that's going to go is community policing. I mean, I think it should be naturally ingrained with what's going on with your local police department, but I also understand where he's coming from with this. So how do we make sure that part of that enforcement, that becomes not just something on the shelf, not something that's good words, but it's actually something to put in practice, and that we do address the issues where we're not making law enforcement the backstop to clean up all our messes. And I've said it before, and I'm going to say it again. And you said there's a representative who's watching. I mean, again, we failed. I'm just saying it flat out. As policymakers, we failed because we put everything else on law enforcement to do. Hey, they're social workers now. Hey, there are people who should go ahead and deal with people, drug counselors, et cetera, their psychiatric episodes, because we haven't put in the investment in other areas to help be preventative on these issues. I don't blame people for calling them because people don't know. How do we educate people? Who else do you call? There's an issue. Well, I'm going to call the cops. Heck, my wife. If there's a snake that's in the front yard, who's she going to call? The police department. Well, should the police department really be having to deal with snakes? But that's what the default is. I know Travis.
It's animal control.
Especially after 5 o'clock, I can guarantee it happens.
Right. So
the
I
community policing part of it is wonderful, but again, Rudy, like I think my department does a really good job at that as well. But it's a managing. Crime control has to come first. We have to be out there, and that has to come first. And then, most people's first contact with government is the police, unfortunately.
Right. Well, I think
which is interesting and key is that it's become burdensome, but the information that Doug's put out there with the same amount of law enforcement that we have in the state of Texas from 1998 to now, people don't understand that. And I can't only imagine how much the population has grown in that time period, so they don't understand it. They don't see that.
Well, look at the members of Congress. You look at the increase in the members of Congress. That'll tell you the growth that we've had in the state. What I think would be great is to vet and find all the things that have gone on, that are going on, that we don't know about, that's existing, and separate that from where we have the discussions of moving forward in a better way. Because I think all this comes down to is when we see an interaction between a minority and the law enforcement person go bad, that then taints the entire well of law enforcement, how people are viewed in the community, and anything and everything that has already been positively put in place. Nobody talks about that. Nobody considers that. Then when you say, how do we fix it? No one knows what's already been in place and implemented. We just want to say, they're against us. These people aren't going to get a fair shake, and law enforcement is after X, Y, or Z. And that's very easy for media to push on the 5, 6, and 10. We'll tune into it. We'll take media and watch that all day long.
I'm sorry, but to point out, Steve, it doesn't necessarily have to be an interaction between law enforcement and a minority that went south. There are certain anecdotes that have been put out there as part of this that had nothing to do with law enforcement. Trayvon Martin keeps getting brought into these conversations. Ahmaud Arbery keeps brought in. Law enforcement wasn't involved in those circumstances.
Understood.
But
Understood.
it keeps getting brought into the conversation for some reason.
Well, because it shows that media wants to pit Black against minority or white or things of that nature and highlight that, and then we can lop it all together.
And I also think too on that subject, Steve, what's happening is you're lumping the criminal justice issues all into one pot. And so you have laws and statutes that need to be reformed that are separate from police conduct. And then
that's what I was saying.
Cases. Yep.
That's why we need to vet out what deals with law enforcement and the positive things that are there and already situated, and then look at what's left and then move forward. Because I think readdressing things that are there that we had no idea exist, that Rudy, you've made a great mention, no one knows. And not even the staffs within the legislature may know the things and the reports that have already been done. We've at least identified that there are several areas that, one, have already been taken care of, no one knows about, two, things that are willing to improve and figure things out, and then three, as you mentioned, Nikki, discerning what's community based versus what's law enforcement based with the community.
And to take it even one step further, and I noticed a question that was asked too when we were talking about the accountability starting at the top, going down, is knowing where to address some of the issues. I think is really important with the community. Is it something that's within the police department policies or procedures? Is it something that needs to be taken to your city council? Is it something that needs to be handled by the mayor, the city manager? Just knowing the different levels and having an understanding of where to go with these processes and with the policies, I think are really important.
And it's tough, Nikki, because, I can't tell you how many times I'm in a city council meeting where people yell at me about what the school board has done. And I'm kind of like, you do realize we're two separate entities and we work over there as well. Or hey, the fire department didn't do this. You do realize they're different from the police department. So they lump, I don't blame people because people are busy and they expect government to function, right?
By the way, Rudy, if you guys will go ahead and annex my neighborhood, I'll be in there screaming at you too.
I was about to say, that doesn't help him when you have constituents like Kevin here too as well.
He's a constituent to be.
Right, I'm a future constituent.
Yes.
But the question is this, is that to your point, Nikki, at least the advocates, right? The people who are trying to make changes to them, they should be educated to a point to, hey, this is where we should be focusing our energy on and everything else with there. And Steve, to your point as well, I also want to talk about this because we're saying lumping in, all sorts of issues that not necessarily applied to law enforcement, it's just lumped in. Don't think that being in the middle of a pandemic and having 40% of African Americans being disproportionately affected, people of color, by COVID-19, don't think that having these minority-owned businesses and what's happened with the economy. The Wall Street Journal had an excellent Department of Labor report that came out yesterday talking about how it's disproportionately affected people of color, particularly Black people, what's happened regarding this recovery or lack thereof. This all is it's a powder keg. It really is. And so how do we unwind all this, try to address these issues in a systemic, articulate fashion, and get things done with it. And, you know, that's the things that I've been really encouraged about seeing these. I've been telling people about these meetings. I'm like, hey, go to TMPA website, go check them out. These are streamed, these are streamed right there as well. See what's being discussed, seeing about these things, and use this as an example, not just for regarding law enforcement, but how things should be done in general. You know, I think that for some reason, decorum has been lost in our society. You know, that, you know, I decorum, respect, the things that you should be, we tell our kids to be like, to do these. I mean, we're acting like these are fairy tales or these things that we put in books. These matter. It makes a difference. And when we act in such a fashion, when we lead in such a way, that makes a difference in how these conversations and discussions and policy and change is made.
And I'm sorry we haven't talked about your new job, Rudy, and we're past 11 o'clock now.
Can we do that? Can we start with that and kind of how maybe we can take what we're talking about now up to this point and then get it disseminated? Because I think, you know, Nikki has mentioned this, Doug has mentioned this. When no one knows what the policies are, no one knows what's already been established. Again, the best example I think is Massachusetts doing their own version of TCOL in 2020. That's been done in 1970 in Texas. That right there.
I think the Redcoats did them in Massachusetts too many years ago too as well. Steve.
Well, Rudy, know that we are hoping that you will utilize us as a resource, as a group of resources, that we are more than willing to be whatever assistance we can be to you in that role, and we're looking forward to it.
I am too, and I'm excited. I'm excited about the role. I'm trying to position, excited to partner with people like yourself. You did an excellent job.
Well, it's great to have the momentum already started in a pandemic that will allow and afford, you know, you to have what I know as the best business call is a personal call, to already have established relationships with law enforcement to assist you. Because, you know, hopefully when Rudy, you step in and you're helping and assisting through the legislative process, that these resources that you can call on now make a huge difference to move things and advance things a lot more efficiently than the normal legislative process, even in a pandemic.
And Steve, I think you should take credit for Rudy's new job, by the way. I think what we should do is we should argue that if it hadn't been for these weekly meetings we've been having, Rudy wouldn't have gotten that job. And if it hadn't been for you making that phone call back in the spring that got all the stars, Rudy wouldn't be in this position. So I think you should take complete credit for it.
This always comes back to Steve.
I tell you what, I've loved being a person of service. It goes to the foundation of what my belief system is. And being a servant, and I serve a servant. And so it's very easy for me to get in a position like this, because we do need to serve others in our community. And if we don't bring the people together to do that the right way, we'll have chaos. And there's some people looking to take advantage of that fact. And we'd like to eliminate that and move forward in a much better way. And we can do that, especially with the groups that we have here and the willingness of the groups. And then Councilmember Mateer being appointed in a position to work with the Kevin Lawrences, the Travis Hammonds, the Clay Taylors, and the Doug Griffiths across the state, so that we do get progress when it comes time starting in January.
I'll be short. I know we got to run, but God works in mysterious ways. And I will tell you, you know, having Steve make that phone call to you, doesn't it seem like a long time? It seems like a long time ago now. And having those relationships, just like you said, relationships matter. People matter. Matters in these positions. It's led to a great spot for that as well. And I think that I'm hoping that whenever from the African American lawyers section, you know, when we're talking about looking at revisiting what our legislative agenda is right there as well, we'll have you guys talking about it, looking for it, and working with us on there.
And Kevin, one other thing before we go, I'd like to ask this, and Nikki and I had talked about this as well. We're looking to do a town hall meeting where we'd appreciate having an aspect of law enforcement, and we'd like to reach out to you as well to be a part of that when it gets scheduled, and we certainly will take into consideration your availability.
Absolutely. We've been more than happy to help out. I was just going to say, you know, the solution to all this is real simple. All we have to do is get 32 million Texans to get involved in conversations like these, and we solve the whole problem.
Well, we don't mind taking the conversations to them. And you know, if we have state reps and things like that also want to be supportive, we also would like to not forget about their resources and their abilities as elected officials to come alongside Rudy and Kevin and the rest of the group.
And you know what, Kevin, to your point, I know you're being facetious. Are we talking to people like their government classes? Like, you know, I'm thinking about these high school government classes, right? And some of these places where, you know, all they have to do is just turn on their internet, right? And they can sit here and they can watch these meetings and they can submit questions. I'm wondering, maybe we should start looking at it because, you know, it starts young. We got to educate them. We start them young. That changes the trajectory and how the relationships go. Maybe something along those lines, talking, you know, having schools and other places.
You know, that's an excellent point. And there is one company that does stuff like that where they take, you know, people from different fields into the classroom, you know, virtually. I'm actually on the list for one of those companies. I've done classes for folks at Dallas Community College and even Chicago and places around the country. I'll bring it up to them. They would be the ones that would invite us. I think that's a great idea. See if they want to allow us to do a town hall with some of these, you know, junior colleges and high schools, and, you know, have these conversations with the students participating.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Well, listen, that's awesome. Certainly appreciate the time today. Representative, is it Tyndall? Is that correct?
Tinderholt.
Tinderholt. Thank you for being a part. We certainly will write that down as a resource as well. And we'll be back next week. We'll start.
A super great guy. You know.
Excellent. And again, we want to continue along. Council member and now president and executive director, certainly appreciate that Rudy, because being with people in the right places, again, it goes back to what you said, Kevin, about management. And if it starts at the top and works its way down, I'm loving the fact that Rudy has been given an opportunity to be at the top and then work with people like yourself and multiple quality people at the top will make a difference.
All right, so next week, same bat time, same bat channel.
Absolutely.
Will we start?
Appreciate y'all. All right.
No bad Tuesday.
Thanks, y'all.
All right. Thanks, guys. See you later.
Bye-bye.